Good morning. My name is Tedman Wong, hearing officer for San Francisco Public Works. Charisse Waiters is the clerk for this hearing. This hearing is being recorded via Zoom and will be available afterward through a link on the San Francisco Public Works website, sfpublicworks.org. As this is a virtual hearing, there's no sign-in sheet, so if you would like to receive information about the results of this hearing, please send an email to the email address listed on the hearing notice. This public hearing is being held to consider two items. Order number 208529 to consider the removal of 2 street trees without replacement adjacent to 301 Lily Street. Staff has approved the removals and the public has protested. Second item, order number 208530 to consider the removal of 4 street trees with replacement adjacent to 1325 8th Avenue. Staff has approved the removals and the public has protested. My job as the hearing officer is to gather the facts for the hearing item, listen to your testimonies, and help our Director of Public Works make determinations. I will not be making any decisions today. Instead, I will forward the findings from this hearing and make my recommendations to the Director. The Director will make the final determinations. When the Director's determinations are made, the department will notify you of them if you have provided contact information. The hearing will proceed as follows for the 2 cases. I will ask Public Works staff to speak first and present the case. Then I will allow the property owner or applicant to speak. Then I will allow Charisse will allow any member of the public to speak. Then if the department would like to address any previous comments, Charisse will allow them to speak. Then if the property owner or applicant would like to rebut any previous comments, they will be allowed to speak. Each speaker will have up to 3 minutes to speak. The clerk will monitor the time for all speakers and will indicate when the speaker has 30 seconds left. If you are a party to this proceeding, you will be called on to speak. If you would like to use visual materials in your presentation, please let us know before you speak. You will then have the standard 3 minutes to provide your comments. If you are a member of the public or a witness who wants to speak, wait for the public comments portion of each item and you will be called on to speak. If you are joining us on a computer, use Zoom's raise your hand feature to put yourself in the queue to speak. If you are joining us on a telephone, press *9 to indicate you are raising your hand. When it is your turn to speak, you will be recognized. And if you are on a computer, unmute yourself before you speak. If you are on a telephone, press *6 to unmute yourself before you speak. If you would like to use visual materials in your presentation, please let us know before you speak. You will then have the standard 3 minutes to provide your comments. Comments and questions should be addressed to me and not to the department or the applicant. If you cannot finish your comments within the allotted time, you may submit written testimony to me by the end of this hearing. If I feel that a question is warranted, I will ask the question. After all comments are completed, I will close the item. We will now begin the hearing. We'll start with any general public comments. This is for members of the public to address the hearing officer on matters that are within the department's jurisdiction, but not on today's agenda. Are there any general public comments at this time?
Mr. Wong, we do have a hand. Go ahead, you should be able to speak. It's from a phone, a caller.
Hello. I find this format to be difficult to use, which is unfortunate at best. For people who are just tuning in by telephone, how are concerns handled?
How are what handles?
Your concern, like, for instance, this is for the Lily Street trees, this is a living alley that was designated by the city as a living alley some years ago, and you're removing 2 trees without replacement. So how does that become part of the public discussion?
That we can talk about that when we get to that item. This portion is for general comments.
Okay. So do I mute myself again now or something? What am I supposed to do here? This is very unuser friendly for the public, I might add.
Charisse, do you want to just clarify how the public can, quote unquote, kind of get in line and raise a hand when it's public comment for the specific items?
Okay, well, I have no idea what the specific items are. I don't have the agenda in front of me like other people have talked about here. I mean, it's a pretty bad forum for public users who are not using the Zoom app. So I'd appreciate any help as to how to actually
Okay.
make a comment when appropriate.
The hearing officer will call the item which you are here for. The first item will be 301 Lily Street, and the second item will be 1325 8th Avenue. So you will hear the hearing officer announce the item. The staff will make its presentation, and after that, then we will call upon the public and the appellants and things like that. So you will be prompted. So you will be able to hear which item is coming up. The item that they're asking for right now are any general comments that are not related to today's agenda. And so that's what this segment is for at this moment.
So items that are not related to the removal of trees on 8th Street or Lily Street.
Correct. Correct. This is just for public comment right now. And
Okay, so
then
my public comment would be, these meetings are very difficult for people to use, and that you are, the inability to actually have a real meeting, COVID precautions can be taken. People can, I think it's ridiculous that we don't have public meetings at this point, is basically what I'm saying. So that's my input on that.
okay, thank you. And your comment has been recorded. So thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And now we have Roz Arbel. Go ahead, you can speak.
Hi, sorry. I just want, I was also a little confused. I'm actually on Zoom. But I see now that you guys prompt and I can lower my hand and unmute my screen and all that kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
thanks. Thank you.
You're welcome. Mr. Wong, I don't see any other hands at this time.
Okay. There are no more general public comments. I will now close the item. This item is now closed. We will now move on to hearing order number 208529 to consider the removal of 2 street trees without replacement adjacent to 301 Lily Street. Staff has approved the removals and the public has protested. We will start with Public Works. May I have Public Works make its presentation?
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Wong and Senior Clerk, Cerise Waiters. Thank you for hosting the meeting. My name is Chris Buck, and I'm the Urban Forester for San Francisco Public Works. And I'm going to do a lot of screen sharing and showing a lot of photos. So bear with me. The other thing is, to begin each hearing, we do talk about some general background, which I think will be helpful just to cover a number of different protocols related to our urban forestry ordinance. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now and pull up that PowerPoint. So let's a moment. There we go. Share screen. PowerPoint. There we go. And then let me get this into presenter mode. So it fills the screen. Cerise, do you see the full screen image, or is it also showing the upcoming next slide?
No, we see the full screen.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for your patience, everyone. So just by way of background, San Francisco Public Works has a goal to ensure safe, clean, and green infrastructure and public rights of way. Our mission at the Bureau of Urban Forestry within Public Works is to preserve and grow the urban forest while balancing the safety and needs of a growing and evolving city. These are some images of the type of work that Public Works performs. We do maintenance and pruning on large trees. We always look to prune to mitigate potential issues with tree structure, public safety. If we don't believe that tree pruning in and of itself can sustain a tree, then the recommendation is to remove. We also make sidewalk repairs related to tree root damage, which is pretty common, not specific to San Francisco. And we also have a significant tree ordinance related to trees on private property that are within 10 feet of a public right-of-way. And we also plant street trees, and we have an urban forest plan, an urban forestry council, and goals to basically plant out every possible planting site within the entire city. So with that, let me move on to my next screen. Pardon me. There we go. And so the next screen I just want to talk about is Street Tree SF. So up until 2017, the city Public Works only planted to maintain 1/3 of the street trees in San Francisco. So those are the major thoroughfares like Van Ness and Geary or 3rd Street, Sunset Boulevard. In fall of 2016, there was a ballot initiative asking the public if the city should take on the maintenance responsibility for all trees in the public right-of-way. That passed by a very large margin. And so since July 1st, 2017, Public Works has been systematically and strategically pruning trees in what we refer to as grid or key map size chunks. And this way we're maximizing our efficiency by getting resources out to blocks at a time. So we prune all the trees on a block. So this is a $19 million set aside. And we also in 2016 completed our census when we discovered that we didn't have 105,000 street trees. We actually have 125,000 street trees. And that's something that was just completed again in 2016. So this image up here from our website shows the amount of completed grids or key maps in the city. And now we're getting out to areas of the city that have fewer trees, smaller trees. So we did sort of the worst first. We did make sure it was distributed across the city so that all 11 districts were receiving maintenance and care. So that's a little bit of background about Street Tree SF and how Public Works now maintains the street trees. We have an ordinance and it establishes authorization and standards for addressing a wide range of issues regarding trees. So San Francisco's Urban Forestry Ordinance is Article 16 of the Public Works Code. And it requires that a removal permit be obtained before a street tree, a significant tree or landmark tree is removed. In February of 2022, there were some important updates to our ordinance. One of the new tasks for Public Works is to maintain a delayed replacement tree report. Formerly, trees were required to be planted within 6 months. It's been reduced to 4 months or 120 days. And if a tree cannot be replanted in the same site, then it must be replanted at a nearby location that does meet the guidelines. Also, if a property owner or applicant is granted a removal permit for removal of a healthy tree, we shall require a replacement tree equivalent value to the one removed or impose an in lieu fee. I will just go over this slightly, but we have, in general, a tree is relatively healthy and sustainable. Our goal is to retain that tree and not remove it. If a tree we believe is no longer healthy and sustainable at the staff level, then we do initiate removal. And this talks a little bit more about that. We just have 2 cases this morning. And my PowerPoint is in reverse order, so I'm going to move forward to Lily. So thank you for your patience. Just want to provide some general background. So we're finally to the agenda item that was announced by the hearing officer, 208-529, 301 Lily Street, the removal of 2 street trees without replacement adjacent to 301 Lily Street. At this property, that's the legal address, but the subject trees are on the Page Street frontage of the property. Our staff approved the removal and the public protested. So next, I'll be going through some images, but also describing our urban forestry inspector who prepared the presentation. On the left side has outlined in bullet points some of the key information we want to touch on within each image. So if you're not able to follow along visually, I'll still be describing what we're looking at. So this first photo is of the tree that's on the uphill side of the property on Page Street. So the tree furthest to the right. And the species is a ficus. It's Ficus microcarpa nitida. It was a very popular tree to plant in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. You can see them in a lot of Hollywood movies that were shot in LA and in San Francisco. They get very large. We have a number of them on Hyde Street and Russian Hill, 24th Street, along lower 24th Street in the Mission, and just really throughout the city. We'll talk more about the species in a few minutes. So we did receive a permit application to remove the tree. Overall, when we're evaluating a tree, we don't look at just the vigor or health of the foliage. We look at the structure of the tree. How likely is it to have a branch failure or a stem failure? Structurally, we look at the tree and just the way that an engineer would look at I-beams and erector sets. When trees fail and we respond to trees, branch failures, or a complete tree failure, what's difficult to predict is when the tree will fail, but something that's a little bit more easily to discern and understand is what part of the tree is most likely to fail. So that's when we talk about evaluating ficus trees for removal. What we're doing is we're really looking at the structure of the tree, its potential for splitting apart or stem failures. In this particular case, we're also looking at impacts to the root system during the sewer repair. So this diameter trunk is 12 inches or a foot at about 4.5 feet up above grade. That's what we refer to as standard height. That's just an industry standard in arboriculture. The trees obviously are providing a wonderful canopy up above in this narrow alley. That said, we look at structure. This tree has competing and codominant stems, past branch failures, and branches that have been repeatedly damaged by vehicles. That typically is due to a lack of clearance directly over the roadway. The notes from our inspectors say that there's been significant root loss due to the emergency sewer repair that was already performed. The tree in this alley is not replaceable because the sidewalk's too narrow. Our current guidelines are established in a director's order that establishes that our minimum basin size needs to be at least 3 feet in width or depth from the curb. So we need a 4-foot path to travel and then a 3-foot basin. So basically 7 feet to work with. And we'll check if it's within this PowerPoint. If not, I can provide it to you, the hearing officer, so that it's in the resulting decision. But the sidewalk is too narrow to plant replacements. In that case, when there's removal due to property owner actions, we assess an in lieu fee of $2,431 per tree for the loss of the tree due to those activities. This next 2 images are just showing, again, the same tree. The image on the right is showing the view up the alley uphill, just showing the lack of growing space for a ficus tree. Although these trees have established vertically, they're genetically want to be wide and horizontal. And so it's been a challenge to keep the trees pruned off the building and clear from the road. This also shows the narrow basin size. that the existing trees have. These squares are approximately, sidewalk squares are approximately 3 feet by 3 feet. So we essentially have a 6-foot sidewalk. And one argument, of course, we'll hear a lot is, well, why can't you just plant it back? You know, it was quote unquote fine. But what we find in alleys is that trees are getting damaged, and it's very difficult to establish new trees in these narrow openings. And so we're looking at prioritizing replacements in areas that have space to actually plant trees. Right now, we don't believe at Public Works that planting a tree in such a small space is sustainable. And so on a case-by-case basis, depending on the sidewalk width, we will state that there's a removal without replacement on that site. And we understand that replacing a tree around the corner doesn't mitigate the loss of the tree for the community that lives right there where they would be most impacted. This image shows the emergency sewer line repair that occurred here in the center of the image, and just showing that there were a lot of roots that needed to be cut. This tree in the foreground is the second tree. It's the tree downhill of the two, and a lot of large roots were cut in order to facilitate the repairs. We do recommend that tunneling occur, not trenching. So tunneling would allow you to preserve roots to make repairs. That said, this is a very narrow sidewalk, and I think it is very challenging to tunnel when you're in such a confined space. So I don't know if that was possible. This is the next tree that we're talking about. It's also a ficus tree. The overall vigor of the tree is fair. The structure itself is poor, but again, overall notes are there was significant root loss due to the emergency sewer repair that was already performed. It's not replantable on this sidewalk on Page because the sidewalk is too narrow. And again, we would assess an in lieu fee for removal without replacement. This is also showing the presence of the sewer traps. We have guidelines for sewer space from new replacement trees from the sewer line. So I do want to confirm if that sewer line is running vertically up the sidewalk, we don't plant a tree within 5 feet of the sewer lateral. So this may not just be an issue of a small narrow sidewalk, but if it is running up the street, that means it's clearly running well, easily within 5 feet of all future potential replacement tree locations. So it's not just the lack of the sidewalk width, it's that we would be literally planting it right back within 5 feet. So we really want at least 5 feet from the sewer line or lateral or vent. Okay, so that wrapped up the photos. I'm going to stop the share, but to repeat, the trees themselves experienced a lot of root loss due to the emergency repairs. The structure of the trees is poor. We have concerns about the stability of the trees. With the upcoming storm season, we recommend the trees be removed before the next storm season. And Public Works will assess the in lieu fees per tree and then plant replacements in the closest nearest locations to that site, but it would not be on the Page Street frontage of the property. Thanks for your patience on the early preamble, but again, wanted to give a description on where the staff recommendation was coming from. And to be consistent with how we handled similar cases, our recommendation was removal without replacement at that site. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. One quick question before we move on. You said that there will be replacement or there will not be replacement?
Not a replacement on the Page Street frontage of the property, but we will plant replacements nearby as required of the code. When an applicant pursues removal, the code actually doesn't require the owner to plant replacements elsewhere because it wouldn't be adjacent to their own property. So the logistics of watering become a challenge. But when we're accepting and requiring in lieu fees, then to that degree, I think Public Works should plant 2 replacement trees, even though this is technically a permit application. The goal is for us to plant all available sites in the future. So once we gather the in lieu fees, we would essentially be funded to plant the replacements on behalf of the owner, more or less.
Okay, thank you. Does any representative from the property owner or applicant wish to speak?
Yes, we have Choku Proudfoot. I'm going to ask you to unmute. You should be able to speak.
Thank you. I don't have a lot more to say. Thank you for the presentation. When we applied, I would just say when we applied, we did intend to plant replacements and we had that on the application. I didn't have the information that you've given now about why that's not possible. So I am kind of sorry not to be able to plant replacements right on Lily. That would have been what we would have liked to do when we applied. Our main reason for doing this was out of concern after we had to do the sewer repair because we had a huge flood. Because the tree roots had grown into our sewer lines, we had to do this repair. We did request the company who was doing the repair that they not damage the trees, but apparently they weren't able to do that. And we didn't find that out until afterward. We are concerned about our neighbors and any damage to anyone that might come from a problem with those trees. The arborist we had come out did say in her report that the trees could be a danger, as you stated, with upcoming storms and how easily they might fall or limbs might fall. And so that's our primary reason for wanting to do this. We would rather keep the trees if we could. So I think that's all I really have to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now, does any member of the public wish to speak?
There's a hand from Timothy Schulte or Schulte. You may go ahead and unmute and speak.
Thank you so much for inviting me here this morning. I greatly appreciate that. I understand that these 2 trees are being removed based on evidence that the root structure can no longer support them, and that there is a risk of damage to adjacent property should they fall. However, my main concern is that you have rules in place which dictate that the sidewalks be 7 feet or more in order to have a new tree replace the ones that are being removed. I've noticed that the vast majority of sidewalks for San Francisco side streets are very narrow. Many of these sidewalks already have trees. My concern is that each time a tree is removed from a side street, it will not be replaced, and we will end up having an issue much like what we see in the Outer Sunset, which is neighborhoods full of concrete with few or no trees. And so the fact that these trees are being removed, understandably so, but with no replacement, really causes me fear that my neighborhood, Lily Street and Hayes Valley, will become a neighborhood like the Outer Sunset. No trees with a lot of sidewalk. I myself went out and I measured the sidewalk. The sidewalk is actually 6 feet, 7.5 inches, and that does not include the curb. The ADA requirements that the sidewalk itself be 4 feet at least wide is being met. The tree area itself, in which the tree is located, is 2 feet, 7.5 inches. So that basically gets us to 6 feet, 7.5 inches which is literally 4.5 inches fewer than the requirement of 7 feet in order to have a tree replacement. Now, I understand that the ficus may not be the best sort of tree for this particular area, given the statement by Chris that it wishes to branch out and be more horizontal than vertical. But surely there are trees that are small-sized or medium-sized that could fit well within this space, whose trunks would not overgrow, whose roots would not pull up and reveal themselves from the soil, and that could be kept in a nice space. And my street, Lily Street, which I'm directly behind the Zen Center, could continue to be a beautiful street and can continue to
30
have
seconds.
the living alley, which I believe one of your other people mentioned. Lily Street has its own history, and I would like that history to be maintained, and I would like the beauty of my street to be maintained, despite your decision that by removing these trees, you will plant trees elsewhere. That does not help Lily Street. That might help Page Street, that could help Hayes Street, that could help Laguna Street, but it will not help Lily Street. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other members of the public who wish to speak?
Yes, we have Roz Arbel. You can unmute yourself and you should be able to speak.
Hey there. I don't have anything prepared to say. And I actually was not aware of this situation until earlier this morning. But listening to everyone's statements, it seems a very, very tragic happening. I'm actually surprised that the contractors who did the sewer line are not on the hook for this. It's, to me, it's very typical of the way the city handles our street trees. You know, it's kind of like the tree comes secondary to anything else. And if they're structurally unsound, I can understand the unfortunate reasoning behind wanting to remove them. However, you know, the spacing issue doesn't really seem to be an issue to me personally. As the last caller mentioned, you know, it doesn't seem as though a lot of thought has gone into the idea of a replacement tree that would be good for that space. You know, I mean, come on, guys. I'm sure that we can figure out something, right? To maintain the beauty of the street. And it is a historic area. Of course, we know about the Zen Center and its history. And as a native San Franciscan myself, you know, that particular space is very special to me. So I would really hope that there could be some going back to the drawing board and a reconsideration of if you must remove the trees, then figuring out a good replacement. And that's all I have to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we also have John Nolte. Go ahead. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Well, it seems that, again, 2 ficus trees that are trying to be removed by on the agenda, and actually all the agenda items are ficus trees today. So the issue I have is that, you know, again, you're targeting ficus trees, putting them all on one agenda. Secondly, again, the Zen Center and that area, we have in the downtown area a number of alleyways, and again, removing trees just because of the width of the sidewalk. Again, I've actually measured and protested and was not even heard when I went to the Board of Appeals on trees that were being removed. And I actually measured, and I had witnesses of measurements, and they were inaccurate to what the city was stating in their presentations of how wide the sidewalk was, and that the trees could go back in or one or more of the locations because of they change at each plot. And so that was just beyond people's comprehension that a tree will go back in just because you have a line of 2 or 3 or 4 trees in an alleyway, and one or more of them can be replanted because of what Buck was trying to imply, this ordinance that was passed again by DPW without the consultation of the city or this of all these alleyways and all these other rules that we do have. We do have a whole book on alleyways and how you consulted in that. Again, it says that we're supposed to be putting back trees on the alleyways in San Francisco, and you're countering all the work from all the different entities that went into those handbooks and multiple pages of alleyways that are north, south of Market and downtown, and these alleyways are located at. So we're turning into a urban desert of no trees, and this is not acceptable. So I suggest that, as stated before by the 2 other callers, that a tree that is appropriate in size and root can go into that thing, into those 2 plots, since you're saying that the 2 trees were damaged because of the sewer repair. So I considered that
30 seconds.
I consider that again, there should be some liability here, not on the property owner, but on the sewer entity that we did the repair, and they should be fined. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I see no other hands at this time.
Okay, thank you, Therese. Does Public Works wish to respond to any previous comments?
Oh, I'm sorry. We do have a caller that's calling on the telephone.
Oh, okay.
So you can, if you press *6, you should be able to unmute yourself, caller.
Yeah, I'd like to say I'm a little confused since I'm using the telephone function. I didn't get to see the presentation that was made by the department, but it seems that is it Page Street or Lily Street we're talking about? Because the postings were put on Lily Street. The discussion from the department seemed to focus on Page Street, which makes no sense. Does the department know what they're talking about? And on Lily Street, I would encourage them to both look at the history of the trees that have been planted there and then think about the future with climate change. And also within the history, take a look at all the other trees in the neighborhood that have been removed and thinking about climate change in the future, how we have cooling centers that have been, at a cost to the city when we could have cooling in our neighborhoods by trees and so forth. I just think that a replacement is certainly required practically by the Department of the Environment, Bureau of Urban Forest. I mean, there's the Living Alleys project. There are so many things in the city that would encourage planting a replacement tree that would be appropriate to the area. So I find it really frustrating that they are not being replaced. And even the applicant has said they wanted to have trees replacing them. So the department gets very confusing information as far as Page Street versus Lily Alley. Page is a street. It's a pretty major thoroughfare through the city, although it's a quiet street at that location. Seems confusing. That's it. And if they could clarify, if they know what they're talking about, like, is it the Page Street frontage or is it the Lily Street frontage? Everybody seems to be talking about Lily except for the department, which is talking about Page. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have anybody else from the public who wishes to speak?
No, there are no other hands at this time.
Okay, then I will return it back to Public Works if they wish to respond to any previous comments.
Thank you, Chris Buck with Public Works, Bureau of Urban Forestry. And thank you for the last caller to clarify. Yeah, that's just me completely misspeaking. The trees are on the Lily frontage. So I apologize for that. I do know Paige. So the subject trees, the 2 ficus, are on Lily Street. So want to confirm that. The only other, I think, follow-up question I have would be in the photos of the looking uphill, upslope, there's an image of the sewer line excavation. And typically a sewer line runs directly perpendicular from a property out towards the road. And in this case, it looks like the excavation is running parallel to the building for like a good 30 feet or so. And so I'd love to confirm if in fact there are circumstances that exist under the sidewalks where you think the utilities are is challenged. So I do want to just confirm that, because we certainly would not be planting trees directly next to that sewer line if the sewer line is running parallel to the building for that stretch directly adjacent. If we could get through or get past the issue with the sidewalk width, that would be one thing, but that we're looking at the sewer issue as well. So I'd love to just clarify that really quickly, if the applicant is still on the line. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And now, if the representative from the property owner or
Yes,
the applicant would like to speak, we can, or respond to any previous comments, we can
Sure.
have them speak now.
thank you. And I would say again that we would like to replant. That was our intention, and that the arborist that we had come out and look at the trees did give us some recommendations of trees that might be more appropriate for that area, and which would presumably not be quite as aggressive with their root system, so that it would be less likely to damage the sewer lines. I don't know the reason for it in a lot of the architectural stuff, but yes, the trench does represent exactly where the sewer line runs. For that section, it runs parallel to the building, and that they only trenched the area that they had to in order to fix. And the problem was that the roots had grown into the sewer line and clogged it in such a way that we had big floods in our building and couldn't use half of our restrooms for a number of months until we looked at a lot of different possibilities for how to deal with this. I wasn't here at the time, but I know that it was explored for a good 3 or 4 or 5 months. We just did without those bathrooms in order to try to figure out how best to do the repair without and we were trying hard to not damage the trees. That was part of the reason we went with what we did, was we thought that the people doing it understood that we did not want to damage the trees. And unfortunately, that's not what happened. And we didn't know that till after the fact. We would like very much to replace those trees. And I didn't realize that we might not be able to. We still need to remove the trees, unfortunately, because they're dangerous. But our preference would be to replace them. And we do have a possible replacement picked that the arborist recommended would be good for Lily and would be less chance of damaging the sewer line. You can see in the photo that's up how you can see the pipe as it runs through the trench there. So that's exactly where it goes, and then goes back into the building, I believe, right at past that upper tree. Thank you.
Thank you. If there are no more comments for this item, I will now close the item and will make my recommendations to the director. Therese, I see a hand.
Yes, Wong, there was another hand. Did you want him to speak again?
I believe he spoke earlier.
Yes.
Yes.
If you have any further comments or testimonies, please look at the chat. You're welcome to send them to urbanforestry@sfdpw.org. And you can email any further written testimony and we will forward it on to the hearing officer for his consideration. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Order number 208529 is now closed. We move on to the next item on the agenda, and that is order number 208530 to consider the removal of 4 street trees with the replacement adjacent to 1325 8th Avenue. Staff has approved the removals and the public has protested. May I have Public Works make its presentation?
Thank you. This is Chris Buck again with San Francisco Public Works, Bureau of Urban Forestry. And let me bring this up to the next item. Thank you. So this next item is regarding the removal of 4 street trees, also ficus trees, with replacement adjacent to 1325 8th Avenue, a Public Works Order 208530 at 1325 8th Ave. So in this particular case, I believe we were reached out to by the SFMTA. There's a parking lot at this 8th Avenue location, and they had just asked about pruning the trees from the closest house there. So one of the things we do, of course, is we evaluate trees and, of course, consider pruning. And when we got out to this site, we looked at the 4 subject trees, and as you'll see, and it's actually quite an extensive presentation, but we found major structural issues with these 4 trees. And so a very simple pruning request from the MTA, unfortunately, turns into a much bigger project. If the trees were relatively healthy and sustainable, we'd of course prune the trees and move on. We're not looking to create a project unnecessarily. That said, we do know a lot about ficus trees, and it was suggested earlier in public comment, that there's something, about ficus trees on the agenda this morning, and we don't. We were still evaluating ficus trees on a regular basis, tree by tree, and ficus trees that have better structure, that have wider angles of attachment. Those trees we are not pursuing for removal. So we still have thousands of ficus across the city that we've evaluated, and professional opinion is that we can continue to work with some of them unless their conditions change. So it's still case by case. But because we do have issues with ficus trees, and it's a tree that we have thousands of, then you do see more of those in our hearings. So yeah, it's totally good feedback, and appreciate that. So the 4 trees are in the public right of way in the sidewalk adjacent to the property. 2 are planted towards the curb, and then we have a bonus 2 trees planted at the back of sidewalk. And you can see the image on the right shows it's been challenging to keep this tree on the far right away from the building, the house. So regarding the inspector notes, we have these 4 trees appear visually as a group of canopy cover together. We do individually look closely at the structure, and each of the trees structurally has serious issues and long history of previous branch or stem failures. So we have attempted to retain the trees until now. Recent failures have left the trees with unsustainable structure. Pruning would result in a tree with less than 10% canopy if you would try to address all the structural issues that we see. Some of them are already losing vigor, meaning a decline in that healthy green growth of new leaves. And as stated, the initial inquiry was to prune. The inspector who was on site determined the likelihood of failure was high, and that the impact of any of these trees failing would also be a high impact. Here's another image viewing the site from directly across the street. This diagram is showing some of the impacts that poor structure and the environment, like wind in our case, have on trees with poor structure, just sort of showing how trees can stand and how trees fail or fall. And so this image is showing when you have a tree, think of an oak tree out in a field with a lot of lower branches, that round globe form can absorb energy throughout its entire form and essentially spread out and dissipate the wind's impact throughout its entire structure. So on the left is an image that is showing a tree that is more stable and easier to withstand wind. And on the right, you have a tree where, when it's been pruned for required clearances, there's also high voltage lines above. So it's creating this very limited canopy growth, which creates what we call a lever arm, meaning the wind hits that canopy and it's sort of a high sail. And that's the mechanism that we're showing here on this screen, showing a higher mechanism where it's really putting a lot of stem compression on both the stems and the trees themselves. So that's what we have here. It's a bit of a diagram to explain the structure that we see. This image shows a branch that failed and then was pruned to create a clean pruning cut, but still has that crack extending into the stem. Poor structure, and there's no way to reduce this tree or prune it without leaving very large topping cuts. The next tree is the one at the back of sidewalk, located very close to that house. You can see in the upper left, the edges of that canopy is starting to look thin and less vigorous. So this tree is in decline. Ficus trees typically should look deep, dark green, lustrous, healthy around. They don't typically have a bad season. They should look super healthy. And these trees are starting to show some decline for sure. This tree to me is an obvious candidate for removal. Its structure is very poor. We've hung on to it as long as we can. What we now have to work with is not sustainable. So the wind is pushing on the canopy. It has this very long vertical exposed interior, which is acting as a lever in terms of the physics of it. So this tree is prone to failure and has poor structure. I won't spend much time on this tree. It's got a lot of issues, competing stems with included bark. Those competing stems with narrow points of attachment are ones that are prone to fail. We have a section on our website at Public Works devoted to structural concerns with ficus trees. And so these trees are kind of fitting all those structural concerns that we've outlined. And trees that have that structure are more prone to fail. The presence of the power lines above has really created this imbalanced canopy with a low live crown ratio. So again, these trees are prone to fail because of the way they've been pruned and because of the poor structure. This is a third tree, the second one that's placed at the curb, very poor structure. We need 14 feet of clearance directly over the road. If we were to try to get that, we would remove this whole section. And again, just showing the poor vigor of the tree. This is showing another view, some of the previous branch failures. You can see when this branch failed, it peeled down the bark. So sometimes people ask, if there's a pruning cut, how do you know whether it was from a controlled pruning cut or a failure? And this is like an example of that. When the bark rips down the trunk, that was nature's work. not the work of skilled professionals. And then you can see the remaining narrow point of attachment below. This is showing some of the pruning that had to occur to maintain clearances from the streetlight. And what we'll end up doing is planting smaller stature trees at these locations. We can plant all four. We'll move one of them a little bit further from the houses. Both trees from the houses are at the back of sidewalk, but we'll plant with small replacement trees that won't get as tall to interfere with the high voltage lines. Certainly not as impactful to the streetlight. Some final images before we wrap up, again showing codominant stems with the narrow point of attachment. So that's a center of the trunk is an area where the tree is likely to fail. And this is a view on the other side. Again, a view from the south looking north, and this view shows actually some of the dead tops of the trees, very thin, sparse canopy. So in our professional opinion, these 4 ficus trees are meeting all the structural criteria for tree removal, although they don't, for ficus trees, although they don't have the height in terms of 50 feet in height. Their poor vigor and the number of structural deficiencies make these obvious recommendations for removal by Public Works. Again, we will plant replacements at all 4 locations. That concludes our presentation for this item. Staff recommended removal, and during the public notice period, we received a protest. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Does any member of the public wish to speak?
Yes, we have John Nolte. Go ahead, Mr. Nolte. Go ahead, Mr. Nolte. You should be able to speak.
Okay, I just received the link. Anyway, so as you see here, multiple issues of how the city takes care of its own trees, and it was stated SFMTA, which is another entity, should normally we should be having a hearing there, because that's what they normally do if it's really their property, instead of handing it off to DPW. And also then the other issue is that since these are all four ficus trees, that the lack of care by the SFMT on their own property, as stated, since this is a parking lot, I assume that's under their jurisdiction. Therefore, the city is not taking care of these trees, and they're not pruning them correctly. And then also what I see here is that, and I have seen correct pruning of trees, where you make it more into a round shape on the top, so they won't have all this spread out of the ficus tree. So the experimental pruning that has been done on other trees, and I have examples of them all over the city, that has been done by either contractors that the city has okayed and or the city itself, and they are still alive, and they're down to only like an inch of the top of foliage. So therefore they are alive, they're fine. And so that would take care of all this wind and all these other creative stuff that was presented. So pruning down to taking off a good 10 more feet on each of these trees would probably be the most prudent way to deal with the structural issues, and also the life of these trees would be better, instead of killing them for the purpose of replacement. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nolte. We have Ms. Ross Arville, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Hi, thanks again. I'm very well familiar with these trees. I spent a lot of time in this area, and they are beautiful canopy trees. As John mentioned, you know, it's a real shame that the weakness of the structure of the tree is basically, let's face it, the result of very poor pruning, not just some limb damage from winds and whatnot, but when Mr. Buck said that it was, you know, they were done by a highly skilled arborist, I was over here laughing because it does not at all seem like the work of a highly skilled arborist. That said, if indeed they need to be removed, which is a horrible, horrible shame, what trees are they going to be replaced with? I mean, one of the reasons why they're so valuable to the neighborhood is because they have a really nice canopy there, which is, you know, creatures hang out in these canopies, and it's helpful to the city. You know, we have the worst urban canopy of any major US city. I know you guys keep hearing that over and over again, but it's the truth. It's getting worse as we remove and remove and remove. So what are the replacement trees going to be? And are they going to actually be trees that have sufficient canopy, or are they going to be little ornamental olive trees? So I have a question. I do have a question about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other members of the public who wish to speak?
There are no other hands at this time.
Okay. Does Public Works wish to respond to any previous comments?
Good morning. It's Chris Buck with Public Works Urban Forestry. And yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the feedback from both callers. To clarify, I think both callers recognize the situation exactly. The pruning, the opportunity for better pruning, proper pruning, really was decades ago. It was both when the trees were planted, even before the trees were planted at the nursery. So there's more specifications on how to properly grow a tree at a tree nursery. And also just in the last 20 to 30 years, a lot more training and recognition, acknowledgement that structural pruning of trees when they're very young is critical so that you can establish a better structure. So I do want to acknowledge that feedback that the trees themselves before were not pruned by a highly skilled arborist and didn't receive enough regular maintenance. So that was definitely something that we're inheriting. Moving forward, we're much more cognizant of that just in the arboriculture industry. And then regarding replacement species, I will check with the urban forestry inspector, and perhaps we could list a couple of the examples, like most likely that we'll replace with. I could forward that to the hearing officer so that it could be included in the resulting decision. Again, we're going to avoid planting a large stature tree at maturity directly beneath the power lines into the side of the power lines. So unfortunately, there are some limitations here, but we will forward those to you as the hearing officers, so those could be included in your recommendation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. If there are no more comments for this item, I will now close the item and will make my recommendations to the director. Order number 208530 is now closed. We have reached the end of today's agenda. Are there any additional public comments on any of the items from today's agenda? If you have spoken, you will not be allowed to speak again. This is for those who might have come late or who didn't have a chance to speak. If there are no more public comments, I will close this hearing. This hearing is now closed.